Today we're going to be leaning into some of the traditions of Studio Ghibli. We're going to paint this classic anime background, a giant field of grass. Now, while Studio Ghibli and other anime background production facilities are going to use something called poster color, today we're going to be using gouache, which is more or less the same. Before we get into how we're going to do this with our paint, we need to first know one key idea that's really going to help inform how to paint a field of grass, let alone just about anything else in nature actually. So let's get into it. So the idea I want to talk about is called patterns in perspective. Now, don't get caught up on the idea of perspective. There's not going to be any lines. This doesn't have to be complicated, but it permeates everything that we see. So it becomes very important to understand this simple concept. We're going to take something like this, just random organic patterns. They could be puddles, clouds, rocks, anything. And we're gonna place them in perspective. Right now, we're facing straight down on top of them. So this is taking them like this and putting them into perspective like this, like we would see if they were all laying down on the ground. And there's something really interesting that happens. We go from standing above them and looking down and seeing something that is relatively as tall as it is wide. However, going from looking straight down at it to looking out across at it, the closer to the horizon it is, the more squished it becomes. And so in our paintings, the closest something is to the bottom of the painting, to looking down on it, the more we're gonna see shapes that still have this vertical height. The further away it is, the closer to the horizon, the more we're just gonna get these almost straight lines coming across until the point where it is almost just straight lines going across. The next thing we're gonna do to this, having looked from straight above to putting our patterns into perspective, is we're gonna give them some depth. So these are the same things that we saw up there, but now they have vertical depth and more interesting things are happening. The shapes that are closer to us have gaps in between them. We can kind of see in between them and they stand on their own, separate like this. However, the further away they get, the more they start to overlap, the more that instead of thinking about them individually like this, we think about them collectively because they're all joined together and we only get occasional gaps in between until at some point up here, we don't get gaps in between. So we look down the ground, we see individual shapes. As these shapes go out into the world away from us, they get compressed this way. So they end up being long, skinny, horizontal shapes. As we give them depth, the ones that are closer to us remain individual looking to some degree, and the ones further away all get grouped together. We can't see in between them side to side, and they start stacking on top of each other, one in front of the other. The things in front of us are going to have really clear depth, and the things behind are going to have lots of overlap as they make these big skinny shapes as they go across. And then we can contextualize it. This isn't just random shapes anymore. This is grass. And the grass that's right in front of us has more individual shape. We get to see a body to it. We get to see vertical depth. The ones that are further away start to group together so that we get these long, skinny shapes and we don't get to see into the grass nearly so much as it goes further back. And what's really striking about this is that without really articulating any one single blade of grass, just by putting the texture on the edges in between the shapes that we see, we get a really big sense of what is happening in this field of grass. We get to feel the individual bunches, but as a whole, they all actually sit together and feel unified. And so we can paint a field of grass without painting just an individual blade of grass, and that is amazing. So let's get back to our painting. This time around, I'm gonna provide some context first. There's gonna be these grand mountains in the background leading up to some foothills into this giant plain of grass. And what I wanna do with this is just play around, get a feel for what's happening in these mountains so that I can really treat the grass accordingly. When it comes to something as ubiquitous as grass, we really want to actually use the grass to best suit the scene. It doesn't take a long time looking at a whole bunch of how Studio Ghibli paints backgrounds, how they paint grass, how they paint anything to realize that there's no single way of doing it. Every scene you see, every movie is done in a slightly different fashion. And the reason this is the case is because each scene is telling a story. Some of the story is about what's happening in the very background. Some of it's about what's happening with the characters. And some of it is about what's happening in the foreground, the feeling evoked or the story being told. And so no two paintings are the same, just like no two stories are told in the same way. In practice, what this tells us is that there is no formula for how to paint something. However, I'm going to take some cues from one way that Studio Ghibli quite often will use grass in their backgrounds, which is to think about the patterns in perspective. For us, this means coming in with these individual groups of grass, big chunks where each different section of grass has a slightly different color, a slightly different feel, and it's moving according to these ideas of patterns in perspective. The chunks of grass in the back are long, straight, horizontal lines. As they come closer to us, we get to see more depth, more individuation. We get to see into the grass a bit more, which means we're going to get a little bit darker, and the shapes become a little bit more rounded. So this is what I'm trying to do as I first come in here and pull in what is essentially the undertone, the undercurrents and the undercolors of everything that's happening. I'm kind of painting in an exploratory way, where nothing I'm putting down is the final voice or the final solution. I want to get a feel for how these pieces of grass are undulating into each other, moving together and working together to create the scene. And you can see that none of this starts by painting an individual piece of grass. It's about the big movements and the big shapes and how they work together. And it's not until later, when we finally have a good feel for how this grass is going to be interconnected and how it feels as a single unit, that we start to really individuate into pieces of grass. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to move my brush like there aren't pieces of grass. That's kind of the whole point, is that as I come in here, I want to pull in texture and I want to pull in movement. But I'm using my paint in a way that the background painters of Studio Ghibli quite often will, which is to say, pretty thin to pretty thick. I'm using it almost like watercolor at the beginning, getting a feeling for what's happening before really committing to thick paint. And so down the bottom, I'm testing out, what is this going to look like when it's finished? And realizing that I really want more color in this. As this is dried, it has set up some of the saturation and the values have diminished, and I want those back. And once I have these big patterns in perspective down, these giant shapes, I can come in and start to feel out maybe the smaller shapes that are involved. Feel out where one thing leads to another, and where one single shape is in fact made up of smaller multiple shapes. And so I first want to pull everything together, give it a more unified sense of big shapes, big movements of colors, before I come in and really split things up. And it's a balancing game. It's unifying everything and then splitting it up, and then unifying it again and splitting it again. And so I finally feel that in this last passage, this last wash of color over top, I'm getting to a point where this field of grass really kind of feels like one big field of grass that is made up of smaller groups. And so it's within this big field of grass that I'm going to come in and start really splitting it up. This is getting a bit more of those small and medium shapes, getting more of those lines, horizontal lines at the back that indicate that this grass and the way this grass is working continues to happen as it goes further back, closer to the horizon line. So I wanted to just differentiate some of the mountain back here. Now that we have everything in, there's a greater sense of clarity and of the things that need to be done. Now, one of the strengths of gouache is this ability just to paint over paint. There's almost a limitless ability to create layers and paint over the top. And later on, I want these individual pieces of grass happening over top of some of the shadows that we see into these big chunks of grass. And so I'm gonna put some darker areas in, knowing that once they dry, I can come back over the top with some more textural grass and really get a good feel for the lights of the grass. Now, once you get a good feel for this, you can see that we've actually painted this relatively dry, which means the paper was dry to begin with, and we're waiting in between layers to get to being able to paint over the top. But if you want to really lean into the Studio Ghibli technique, you wet the paper to begin with, the whole thing, and you spend a good amount of time getting these nice big chunks of grass while everything is wet. But I wanted to show you guys this in a bit more of a dry, stable, easier to do kind of way before we really get to something like that. But now we have this big expanse of grass before us. I want to start to put in more details. This means at the moment some of the flowers on top. And what's really interesting is you can see again that we really are still painting these with patterns in perspective in mind. So some of these white flowers that you can see, they're big clusters of flowers. And the ones that are closer to us, they're more expansive. We can see the individual little pieces to it. We can also see more of a vertical to it. There's more of a roundness to the shape. And as they either move away from us or start to face away from us, they're going to be communicated more just with lines. All of that information compressed into a much tighter horizontal line. Everything we do is patterns in perspective. It really is. And the more you can start to see this, the more it makes sense for how to really paint things and how to communicate well when you're really communicating a vast sense of difference. And this doesn't have to just be on the ground. The same thing is going to happen if you're painting a wall or an array of clouds in the sky or the side of a mountain turning away from us. It's all going to have this same sense of patterns in perspective. And once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. And so I'm putting in some shadows here underneath some of the flowers to just give a little bit more distinction to what's happening. And then we're going to put in some detail. Now, I'm not really going to dive into detail this time around. It's not really what I want to talk about. If you want to talk about detailing grass like this and really working into a bigger piece, let me know. And if you want to learn to start painting with gouache like this in a way that's going to be freeing and allow you to start focusing on the creativity instead of being frustrated by the medium itself, I have a free online workshop called The Roadmap to Painting with Gouache, where I show you how I would learn to paint with gouache if I had to start all over again. Because it has taken me years to get to the point where I am, and it just doesn't have to take you quite so long. The link to that is in the description below, and I would love to see you over there.